Hello and welcome to The World Today on Channels Television. I'm Cynthia Are. Here are our top stories. Now, despite the unfortunate killing of the American journalist James Foley, the United States remains committed in doing its bit to restore peace to Iraq. As a result, U.S. aircraft have launched fresh strikes against Islamic States as the IS militants in northern Iraq, and that's despite threats from the group to kill a second American captive in retribution for continued attacks. U.S. Navy fighters and drones have provided air cover to Kurdish and Iraqi forces battling IS near the city of Mosul.
This is the cause for which the United States is fighting. Well, here is the cost.
To rise up against my real killers, the U.S. government.
With journalist James Foley's death confirmed, U.S. President Barack Obama had a message for the Islamic State militants who killed him.
When people harm Americans anywhere, we do what's necessary to see that justice is done, and we act against ISIL, standing alongside others. The people of Iraq, who with our support are taking the fight to ISIL, must continue coming together to expel these terrorists from their communities.
Obama's statement came less than 24 hours after the release of video by Islamic State militants showing Foley beheaded. The video warns of greater retaliation to come against Americans following nearly 2 weeks of U.S. airstrikes that have pounded Islamic State positions in Iraq. But Obama says the fight will go on.
Governments and peoples across the Middle East, there has to be a common effort to extract this cancer so that it does not spread.
And for the Foley family, news of James's death is still sinking in.
It's horrific. I mean, people can die in lots of different ways, but this blow was the most horrific.
Another journalist, Stephen Sutloff, is also believed to be a hostage of the militants, who say his survival now depends on what the U.S. does next in Iraq. However, refugees in Iraq's North Kurdistan region are in urgent need of more help despite the latest humanitarian aid pushed by the United Nations Refugee Agency. According to officials, resources including food, water, and shelter are critical in need for those displaced in Iraq's northern area, mostly in the Kurdistan region, which has been contending with both Syrian refugees escaping the civil war in their country and the latest Iraqi refugees from areas overrun by the Islamic State ISIS. To counter the massive humanitarian crisis facing Iraq, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees launched what it has said is one of the largest humanitarian aid pushes in more than a decade, aiming to help those who have been forced to flee their homes. The UNHCR recently warned that the deepening crisis brought on by the onslaught of ISIS militants is overwhelming the ability of aid agencies to respond to the growing humanitarian needs. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has also called on the international community to do more to provide protection to the refugees in northern Iraq.
Well, for more on the situation in Iraq, I'm now being joined by the Voice of America's Sharon Ben, who is in Washington at the moment. Sharon, thank you so much for speaking with us on The World Today. Now, the U.S. government is unrelenting in its pursuit to restore peace to Iraq. But now, is the government really winning this war against the IS? And, I'm also trying to ask you what the cost, if the cost is also worth it on the part of the United States.
Well, I think that's a really good question, but I would craft it or say it a little bit differently. The way President Obama has designed the airstrikes is not necessarily to wage war in Iraq. What he has said is that the airstrikes are to protect the refugees who have been fleeing, the ethnic and religious minorities that have been, pursued by IS, by the Islamic State, and that these airstrikes were to both protect the refugees and to protect American personnel who are still in the country. So the U.S. government has been crafting it in a very, very careful way. They're not saying that they're actually waging war. I think what happened was after the American journalist Jim Foley was beheaded and that tape was delivered around the world by the Islamic State, that has suddenly tipped things a little bit. I think President Obama is going to have to now work on perhaps developing a different foreign policy when it comes to coping with this Islamic State threat.
Now, we also understand that the U.S. has attempted a rescue operation recently to free a number of American hostages held in Syria. And that operation also involves air and ground components. What details do you have concerning that rescue attempt?
Actually, there are very few details concerning that particular rescue attempt, and there has been a lot of surprise that any details at all have come out about it, because usually the Pentagon or the government is not very keen on talking about things that have not worked. What we do know is that earlier this summer there was an attempt, an air and land attempt, to rescue the hostages whom they were getting information were getting very close to becoming in more harm's way, that they were in danger of dying. So there was a rescue attempt launched at the beginning of summer. It was launched in Syria, but when they arrived at the target area, the hostages had been moved. They were gone, and apparently they had arrived several days too late, and everybody was gone, and it was a complete failure. Now, we don't know if there were any other rescue attempts. Maybe there were, that the government is just not talking about.
Now, finally, Sharon, another captive identified as American journalist Steven Sotloff was shown at the end of that depressing video with the warning that his fate depends on President Obama's next move. Now, what do you think will be done to ensure that he doesn't suffer a similar fate as Foley?
Well, I think, first of all, it's very interesting that the Islamic State said, it now depends on Obama, on President Obama, on what he does, the fate of this journalist. I think it has to be pointed out the Islamic State has been killing by beheading and crucifixion many, many people. It has both Muslims and Shia Muslims, Yazidis, anybody that they feel stands in their way, they have been killing. So they're trying to portray this now as, President Obama, you were responsible for this person. So I think that's an interesting manipulation on the part of the Islamic State. As far as the American government is concerned, right after that video was released, including the threat on Sotloff, the U.S. conducted another series of airstrikes around the Mosul Dam where the militants have been fighting. So it didn't seem that they were going to succumb to any kind of threat, and normally the U.S. government does not succumb to threats from any kind of terrorist. So I don't think that they are going to change their policy right now in order to be able to avoid the death of Sotloff. But what his fate will be, I really don't know. I don't think anybody does, but I know that if you've seen the world reaction to the beheading of Foley, everybody's been incredibly shocked and horrified at the brutality of it. And I think they would be equally shocked and horrified if anything were to happen like that to Sotloff.
Well, we certainly hope that's not the fate of Sotloff. Thank you so much for speaking with us, Sharon. I've been talking to the Voice of America's Sharon Ben, who is live in Washington. Thank you for speaking with us. Now, there is relative calm in Ferguson, Missouri, where a black teenager was killed by police after a visit by the U.S. Attorney General, that's Eric Holder. He praised the public for their good behavior and also mentioned that there was no violence and only 6 people were arrested. He made the statement after having been briefed about the situation yesterday. Well, following a forensic investigation into clothing and swabs taken after the murder and alleged gang rape of 2 teenage cousins in northern India, they've concluded that they were not sexually assaulted. The girls were found hanged from a tree in Uttar Pradesh state back in May, in a case which sparked global outrage. 3 suspected attackers were taken into custody, along with 2 policemen. At the time, a local post-mortem examination confirmed multiple sexual assaults and death due to hanging. The case was initially investigated by the state police, but later handed over to federal investigators at India's Central Bureau of Investigation. Last month, the CBI attempted to exhume the bodies of the girls, but their graves were under floodwaters and remain inaccessible to this day. Now, Thailand's junta leader Prayuth Chan-o-cha has been named the new Prime Minister of the Southeast Asian nation. The general, who's 60 years old, was nominated today in a legislature handpicked by the junta and made up of mostly military and police figures. The general was the head of the army when he led a dramatic coup back in May. It followed months of intense political deadlock between Yingluck Shinawat's government and opposition parties that resulted in protests and clashes. General Prayuth was chosen after all 197 members of Thailand's National Assembly cast their votes this morning.